My name's Lisa Shaw and I'm Professor of Brazilian Studies at the University of Liverpool in the UK. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the Rio de Janeiro Carnival. The Rio Carnival is the biggest carnival parade in the world. Every year it attracts about 8 million partygoers and 1.5 million of those are tourists. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the history of Carnival in Rio and the costumes and the music in particular. Here we see an image of what's known as the Samba Drome. This is the purpose-built arena where the parade in Rio takes place and where the groups competing for the prize every year parade. Each group wears a different colour. As we can see here, we've got several groups processing, and each is known as a so-called Samba school. These are essentially neighbourhood carnival groups. Each has between 3,000 and 5,000 members participating in the parade every year. The 12 elite groups that compete for the top prize have between them 3,000 drummers, and we heard some of that percussion drumming at the beginning when you were coming into the auditorium. Today I'm going to be talking about a woman who has been represented in Carnival and been very instrumental in the evolution of the music and the costumes. You may recognise her from this image. You may have noticed when you came in, I'm wearing a badge or a pin with her likeness on it. And we see here people, including men and children, dressing as her, which is a very typical Carnival costume. Put your hand up if you can recognise this lady. You may not know her name, but have you seen her before? She's often called the lady in the tutti frutti hat for the extravagant turbans that she wears. I see lots of hands, and I see a few people saying that they know, nodding when I asked you if you knew her name. This is Carmen Miranda. She was actually born in Portugal, but she's really a Brazilian at heart, or was. She was born into a very humble family living in the centre of Rio in the early 20th century, but she went on to become the highest paid woman in Hollywood in the 1940s. She became a major global star of screen and in the music industry. And here we see her in one of her famous roles in a film made by 20th Century Fox, and it was called The Lady in the Tutti Frutti Hat, this number, and this is really why she's known by this nickname. And here we can see one of her very extravagant turbans, often laden with tropical fruit. This is a film called The Gang's All Here. Anybody seen it or heard of it? It's a great film, a Busby Berkeley film, so well worth watching. I can highly recommend it. Now, Carmen Miranda took with her to Hollywood a very characteristic costume, and I'm going to explain the roots of that costume now. It's called in Brazil the baiana costume, and typically it includes a turban, rather over the top extravagant frilly dress, often with a little bit of shoulder or bare midriff showing, lots of exaggerated costume jewellery, and usually high platform clogs or platform shoes. Now the baiana is today still very much a part of the Rio Carnival. Each of the Samba schools, these groups that I mentioned that are performing and competing in the parade, has to have certain key elements. And one of these elements is called the wing or the group of baianas. And these are traditionally Afro-Brazilian ladies who are slightly more mature, so I identify with them, who process in the carnival. And they wear these very large, cumbersome costumes, very beautifully decorated. So it's essentially a version of the Baiana costume that Carmen took to Hollywood. And I'll be talking now about where those costumes, the inspiration for them, comes from. The word Baiana simply means a woman from Bahia. This is the state of Bahia in northeastern Brazil. And here's a close-up of the state. The state capital is called Salvador. Often it's abbreviated because it's Salvador da Bahia, so people refer to the capital city also as Bahia. So Baiana can mean a woman from the state or from the main city of Salvador da Bahia. Now, Salvador was one of the main ports of entry for enslaved Africans during the Portuguese colonial rule of Brazil. So it's often described as the city with the most African influence in Brazil, particularly linked to West Africa. So it has a very rich culture, not only in music, but also in food and even religious practices that relate closely to West Africa. In Salvador, during the colonial era, and also in Rio de Janeiro, which was the capital of Brazil from 1763, Afro-Brazilian women, many of whom were still enslaved, but some of them who had acquired their freedom after abolition in 1888 in particular, earned their living by cooking these typical African dishes and selling them on the streets of the big port cities like Rio and Salvador. And this is a tradition that you still see today. So these women are also known as Baianas, and they wear a white version of the costume, which is very closely linked to the simple white cotton and lace costumes worn by street vendor women in West African markets. The Baiana costume can also still be seen today. Here we see again it represented in white, not so colourful as Carmen Miranda's version, in the Afro-Brazilian religion Candomblé, which, if you like, is a kind of Brazilian version of voodoo, which has none of the negative connotations that the word voodoo might have in English. It's simply a religion that's created by a blend of Christianity, Catholicism, because those who were enslaved in colonial Brazil were forced to convert to Catholicism, so they mixed it with their own West African beliefs and spirits. So this is the religion that's still practiced today by up to about 8 million Brazilians. So these women also wear the Baiana costume, and they are also very linked to carnival, as I'll explain now. So Carnival in Rio really took off in about the second decade of the 20th century, and it was very much linked to these Afro-Brazilian women, many of whom were formerly enslaved or the descendants of the enslaved, who migrated to Rio after abolition in 1888, or who were working in Rio before then. This is probably the most famous example. Her name is Tia Ciata, and she is one of the women who was responsible for bringing together musicians in her home in the centre of Rio, near the port, where the samba rhythm evolved alongside the practice of the Afro-Brazilian Candomblé religion, as we've just seen. So she was very much instrumental in these gatherings and parties where the samba rhythm evolved. They say she got away with having these parties because she was married to a policeman, which seems probable because it was very much an outlawed form of music, as the white elite feared the Afro-Brazilian poor and their potential revolt against enslavement that they'd had to endure. Now, Tia Ciata's house was just off this square, which is called the Praça 11, and it's no coincidence that that's where, in the 1970s, the Brazilian government chose to build the Sambadrome. This, as I mentioned earlier, is the purpose-built arena where if you get the chance to go and see the Rio Carnival, you will sit and watch the processions pass by and compete. So this area was demolished, sadly, and it's been replaced by this area where the Samba drome is performed. So that essentially was just a taste of the full lecture that I could give on this topic. I would then go on to talk about the history of Samba in particular in more detail. We'd look and listen to some early examples from the 1920s, which sound very different to the percussion-based drumming that we heard at the beginning. And then I'd show how Samba evolved in Rio, relating that to the different social and historical context, and also return to Carmen Miranda, show how in Hollywood and then throughout the world, thanks to Hollywood, she took the Samba rhythm and it evolved along with the Baiana costume. And then they made their way back to Brazil, where, as we saw, she is still celebrated in Carnival today. I would then open to discussion and Q&A and invite the audience to ask me any questions they may have. Thank you.